Good evening, Mayor and Council members. I'm Caitlin Graham, Financial Analyst. Tonight, we officially kick off the 2025-2026 biennial budget process. To start us off, this presentation is for FCS Group and staff to provide a presentation regarding the general fund's long-range financial forecast. Per our financial policies, we are directed to prepare and update on a biennial basis a 6-year financial forecast. This biennial planning process will enable citizens, staff, advisory committees, and the City Council to discuss current and future programs, service levels, and capital facility needs as part of the biennial budgeting process. And with that, I will pass it off to Matt Hobson from FCS Group.
Thanks, Caitlin. Evening, Mayor Schilling, council members, city manager. Great to be with you this evening. I have about a 10-minute presentation teed up here for tonight. And as Caitlin mentioned, this forecast of the general fund covers the 2025 to 2030 time period. It accounts for known and anticipated changes to the cost of providing existing services. It does not account for spending to support new services that may be approved as part of the 2025-26 proposed budget process. The purpose of this forecast then is to provide a lens by which to gauge the financial resources that you have available for this budgeting process. We'll cover kind of the financial policies that form the basis for developing the forecast. I'll briefly cover some of the key assumptions that are driving the results you'll see, and then we'll talk briefly about the results and what they mean. I do want to acknowledge just personal preference. There's a new face here. I do want to mention it was a pleasure working with Eric Christensen since 2018, and I've been working with Caitlin as well. It's a pleasure to continue working with her. Okay. In fact, we'll skip this here. Now, if I've used this quote before, I apologize. I just really believe in it. It's by a futurist known as Paul Sappho, and he says, the goal of forecasting is not to predict the future. Rather, the goal is to tell you what you need to know to take meaningful action in the present. My presentation tonight is hopefully geared to do just that. I'll be providing an outlook of major trends influencing the general fund resources and the use of those resources. Developing a long-term financial forecast is a best practice in public finance. As such, the city has established policies to guide this forecasting process. Some of the key guidelines in city's financial policies are, one, we take a conservative approach for forecasting revenues and expenses. We're not trying to hit the 10 on the dartboard. We're trying to be conservative in how we predict revenues. We want to maintain prudent financial reserves to manage just the natural fluctuations in the receipt of revenues and the timing of expenses. What that means is we want to hold at least 20% of recurring revenues in a financial cash reserve to account for those natural fluctuations and for the unanticipated. These types of financial reserve policies are also a best practice in public finance. The general fund, in addition to that operating cash reserve, we also want to hold back as restricted around $10 million that's set aside for cash reserves for the upcoming capital projects the city has scheduled. So as we evaluate the financial health of the city's general fund, we're looking at the city's ability to maintain these reserves at the minimum target levels. Another way that we measure the health of the fund is evaluating its structural balance. A structurally balanced budget has two defining characteristics. One, recurring revenues equal or exceed recurring expenses. And two, our one-time revenues are not committed to recurring expenses. What that looks like, it's about aligning our resources with our spending. As you see in the graph here, we want to align those recurring revenues with recurring expenses, always having money available to pay for those things we know are going to be paying for today and in the future. And then making sure that if we do have one-time resources, that we're being strategic about aligning them to one-time spending. This is what is known as a structurally balanced budget. It's not always possible, but it's a vision you try to achieve within the proposed budget process and the forecast process. So using these evaluation criteria, our outlook for the city's general fund, I would say, is positive. The general fund is at or near structurally sound over the next 6 years. We do anticipate a slight deficit in the outer years of the 6-year forecast. In the years where the city is projected to have a slight deficit, there is sufficient cash reserves above those minimum cash reserve levels to manage that difference. Because forecasted revenues are generally sufficient to pay for existing services, we do recommend that any new services that are identified as part of the proposed budget process, that the city actively look for corresponding revenue sources to offset those new spending costs. I'll briefly cover kind of the nuts and bolts of the forecast here and then talk again about big picture. So we use the 2024 adopted budget as the basis for developing a forecast of spending and of revenues. Another key forecast assumption is the cash available today. It's that second box on the top row where it says fund balance. You'll see that there's about $40 million at the beginning of 2024 available in cash reserves. I do want to provide a little bit of context on that number because it sounds like a lot. And it is. I've never seen $40 million. So of the $40 million, $17 million is restricted either by city policy or because it's grant funding tied to the COVID-19 pandemic recovery fund. So $10 million of this from the capital partnership reserve, another $7 million is restricted for only uses that are grant eligible from the COVID-19 pandemic fund. So that really says you about $23 million. The remaining is unrestricted. Some of the main cost drivers of the forecast are general cost inflation assumed at 3% per year. The police contract with King County assumed at 4% per year, and that's based on historical trends. We typically see that contract increase by. I'll talk through the city liability expenses here in a bit. We are forecasting market increase in those expenses over the next 2 years. And then one element that is on the, well, it's the next slide. Let me jump to that. The revenue forecast also accounts for the tax and fee increases adopted by the City Council in 2024. And so that includes the tax rate increases to the water and utility tax rates, the increase to the business and occupation tax rate, and increases to select planning fees. I don't often get a chance to talk about interest earnings on investments. It's a really small piece typically in a forecast, but as you likely are aware, interest rates are at a historic high right now. I know they reduced by 0.5% last week, but those high interest rates do produce a sizable revenue stream to the city today. We are assuming that over the next couple of years, interest rates will come down to more historic levels. That's not a prediction, it's a conservative assumption. I want to make sure that's clear. I'm not the Feds. On the expense side, we start with the 2024 adopted budget. That's our starting point for developing the forecast. But we know there's spending in today's budget that's one-time in nature. So we're going to carve that out and not include it in the forecast. We also know that there are certain expenses in 2024 that will be offset by the COVID pandemic-19 recovery fund. And so because those have a dedicated revenue stream and they're more one-time or short-term in nature, we also carve those out of the forecast. So the basis for the 2025 outlook and beyond, I can look up here and see the number, is about $36.8 million, which is markedly lower from your adopted budget of $45.4 million. So with the next couple of slides, I want to paint a picture for the forecast. On the revenue side, we'll talk about 6 major revenue sources for the city's general fund. The first is property taxes, one of the largest sources of revenue for the city. We are forecasting 1.9% annual increase in that tax revenue, and that's a combination of 2 factors. One, the city's regular levy goes up 1% a year. In addition to that, any new construction that happens throughout the year, the city can assess the full levy rate on that new construction. And that's an effective 1.9% growth rate. The next revenue stream is the city's sales tax rate on retail activity. We have that conservatively assumed increasing at essentially the cost of inflation. Historically, the city's sales tax revenue has outpaced inflation. Once again, this is a conservative estimate. For the utility taxes, you'll see a one-time bump, I'm sorry, on 2025. That's due specifically to the city council's action in 2024 to raise water and utility tax rates. And you'll see a similar bump on the B&O tax rate revenue beginning in 2025, a slight increase for that 1 year, accounting for the increase in the business and occupation tax rate. For building permit revenue, we are being conservative. The city has seen some market development over the last couple of years. The forecast you see here is based more on long-term averages. Finally, with regards to other revenues, you'll see a higher revenue in 2024, and then it kind of slows down and becomes smaller in the outer years. And that's a direct result of us assuming that interest rates will go down a bit over the next long term. So overall, that's the forecast of revenue. On expenses, just briefly talk through those. We have the police department as the largest department, increasing by around 4% per year, mostly tied to the increase in the annual contract rate escalation for police services. Several departments, you'll see that there's either no change in 2025 or even a decrease. And that's the result of removing those one-time expenses from the budget for our forecast. Or there are certain expenses that will be reimbursed or paid for from the COVID pandemic recovery fund, and then they will go away, assumed in the forecast. Parks is one of those examples. Now, Caitlin runs a pretty big department, but I'll point out that the largest expense in finance is actually the SCORE contract for the jail services, and that's why it appears to be a large department. Other services we'll talk briefly about is, I can see the screen here a little easier. I'm sorry. Yeah, administrative services is a similar story where we have a lot of one-time expenses that we're not forecasting in the future. I'll talk briefly about under the legal department, the city's liability insurance expenses are part of that budget. And we are assuming based on recent cost estimates that expense will increase 20% per year over the next 2 years, followed by 3% a year, followed by general inflation. The assumption behind that is based on claims experience for the city and then estimates provided to the city. This is a forecast. We're not predicting the future. We're saying this is something that may happen and what would be the impact on the city's general fund. I'll talk briefly just on the other ones, other departments. You'll just see kind of a similar trend. We'll see either a reduction or a steady state in 2025, and then a growth rate followed by cost inflation. What I point out is our forecast for 2025 is actually less than our budget for 2024, and that's because we've removed a lot of those one-time expenses. So big picture, talking about being structurally sound or a structurally balanced budget. What we want to do is compare our spending patterns over the next 6 years against our revenues. The spending is in the columns, the revenues are on the line. You can see that generally if we discount the cost of an increased liability expenses, that revenues are pretty much keeping pace with our spending. And it's this new change essentially we've seen in the last, since we started the forecast process, expecting a higher increase on liability insurance. And while this information isn't necessarily good news, financially speaking, it kind of speaks to the role of the forecast process. It's an active process that is there to guide decisions each year. One of the primary benefits of this process is that trends are identified early on, which allows you to make small tweaks to your financial plan, as opposed to waiting until relatively minor challenges become major issues. So that's one way we measure kind of the financial health of the general fund is comparing revenues against expenses. Another way we can measure financial sustainability is the use of your reserves and your adequacy of those cash reserves. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are 3 types of reserves within that $40 million cash balance. The first is $10 million that's allocated for the capital partnerships reserve. The second, oh, you have it right there. Thank you so much. The second is the minimum target for the operating reserve. That's the 20% of recurring revenues, holding back every year to manage cash flow. And the amount of above that is the city manager's designated reserve. Overall, we're forecasting that reserve to be around $30 million at the end of this year, and ending somewhere around $24 million by the end of the forecast. Is that good? Is that bad? The answer is, well, your financial policies have you staying around $20 million. And so we forecast by the end of 2030 that the general fund would still have $5 million in excess of your minimum targets for cash reserves based on this forecast. So in summary, our outlook of the general fund is generally positive, that there is a structured balance, especially early on in the forecast. We do anticipate some type of deficit later on, but your cash reserves are sufficient to manage that deficit and still stay beyond that minimum targeting cash reserves. I do want to point out that looking forward through the 25-26 budget process, as you contemplate new spending or new service levels, just to be cognizant that there may not be today a corresponding revenue to offset those new services. And so being aware that if you, in a best case scenario, having a new revenue option available to fund new services. That concludes my presentation. I hope it was 10 minutes. If not, I apologize.
Any questions, comments?
Well, thank you very much. And I know that we will have a public safety levy on the ballot next year, recommended by your firm from a financial forecast from maybe close to 10 years ago now?
2018.
Yeah, 2018. Okay,
Yeah.
so we are discussing new revenue opportunities. So thank you for your presentation and that information. Are there any questions or comments from that? Councilmember Ake?
Thank you very much. I actually enjoy reading this stuff. I think the one that made me cringe the most was the line of like not quite meeting our goals. And I'm interested in seeing that happen and knowing ways that we can do that. I know the levy might do that if hopefully the levy will pass, because I definitely see that we need to consider income sources for this city to be able to expand its services and provide the best level of services that we can to our community. So I'm really interested in seeing what that will look like. My question, I guess, is so we're reviewing this now. You're saying that between 27 and 2030, we may not meet all of our goals on our budget. So what do you see coming forward? Are we going to be looking again at additional increases in some of those areas we already increased, like the B&O and those other taxes? Or do you think this is going to kind of flesh out as we move forward and we won't need to do that? Do you have any crystal ball on that piece?
I wish we had a crystal ball. More so, it's going to help us make decisions now. So if we do new programs, new expenditures, that shortfall we could see in 2030 could happen sooner. But again, this is all just our best estimated guess. So it's just to help us figure out as we go through the budget process over the next couple of months. It's like right now we're good. But if we add a bunch of new stuff, we could not be good sooner. So just to kind of get us all on the same level before we start this whole process of what do we want to do in the next 2 years for Burien.
Councilmember Moore?
I had a couple of questions. The first one is just watching the city manager's reserve go down as the years go by. Is its function to be a ballast for the budget to keep it afloat, or is it for emergencies or unplanned expenses, or how is that used as part of keeping the budget going?
I could just add very quickly, yes. It is meant to serve as a ballast to keep the ship afloat. It is meant to serve as a short-term reserve to make ends meet. It is meant to serve as a mid-range reserve to make ends meet longer periods of time. But it is not meant to serve as a long-term payment fund for programs or services or employment that does not have a revenue to support that item. So for an example, if there is a significant or an immediate need for a new employee, we don't have the revenue to pay for this person, the manager's reserve fund may be used as a way to fund a temporary limited employment for a year or 2 years maximum. So we bring the person aboard, use the reserve funds in this way as a short-term method. And that is a way to spend the money. But if we find that we need a person, we just don't have the money for it, and we need to find this, revenue long-term, the options we have are either raise revenues through an immediate ballot initiative, a levy, or to cut somewhere else, cut employment in a different department. So yes, it is a ballast, it is a short-term relief, but it is not meant for long-term payment.
Can I ask the city manager a follow-up on that? So does it just start out as a sum and it gets smaller year to year? It doesn't replenish year to year?
It replenishes in the way we would if we have, interest income. We've had higher than normal interest rates over the last 2 years, so we generated some revenue there. But once the money kind of typically goes away, there are potentially surpluses that could be reallocated at the end of the year. We try to not have too big of a surplus because we try to have a respectable, a budget that's respectable to the taxpayer and not essentially just tax to tax. So we do have some surplus at the end of the year that could be allocated in certain ways depending on our financial policies. So in some ways it is replenished, but the expenses far outweigh the revenues even in the replenishing of the funds, which is why we see the manager's reserve fund decreasing over time, and it has since 2018, 2017, so roughly.
Thank you.
Since there's a little bit of money in the city manager's reserve fund, I'd like to request that we get those lights to work outside because I hurt my knee on Saturday because I couldn't see that big rock that was right there where you sit on. Thank you very much.
Too much fiestaing happening?
That woke me up real fast.
Any other questions or comments for our long range forecast? Will we see you back by the end of the year? What's our next steps with the finance department?
You will see me a lot before
Great.
the end of the year.
Good.
So yeah, so coming up in October, we'll have our first presentation on the general fund, the capital budget. We'll have departments come in, talk about their plans for the next 2 years,
Great.
and just move our way through to adoption in December.
Great. For the capital fund section of that, could we request some information on the capital budgets associated with legislative asks? So I'm thinking specifically about the public works facility and where we're at, kind of an update on where we're at with finances for that and what we need to ask for from the legislature.
Yes. Okay. So let me make sure I got this jot down right. So capital stuff, anything particular that has to do with legislative
Correct.
action. Okay.
Correct.
Got it.
Anyone else have any financial requests? Okay, that's it for me too. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. All right, our city council. Oh,
If I
yeah,
may, sorry to
yes.
interrupt, just in the transition in finance, I just wanted to acknowledge that Caitlin has really stepped up with our other staff member, Anna Swart. They both have really taken the helm, managed the department, and it's just testament to the department that was built by Eric, and then also just the excellent team members that we have in the finance department to really get us across. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you.